G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the Book of Daniel. I pray that it will be of benefit to you in helping your Christian growth. This has been taken from the commentary series by Dr. Alan Fruchtenbaum of RL Ministries. So we're into this session 20. We're looking from chapter 11, verse 21 down to 39, hopefully. Now, last session we covered, we're looking at the king of the north, Syria, who was at the time Antiochus III the Great, against the king of the south, Ptolemy V. Antiochus defeats Egypt with help by Jews who had led a separate rebellion in the hope of being free from Egyptian domination. But this failed because they got free from Egyptian domination only to fall under Syrian domination. And that dominion over Israel is transferred securely into Syrian hands, and it will remain pretty much right there until for the rest of the Hellenistic period. Antiochus III, his expansion led to a conflict with Rome, and now he had to shore up his position of strength. So he tries to make an agreement with Egypt by marrying off his daughter Cleopatra I to be the wife of Ptolemy V. Epiphanes. Remember, the Ptolemies were from Egypt, the Seleucids from Syria. Now, this Ptolemy V was only 7 years old at the time that he was married to Antiochus' third daughter, and by doing this he hoped to gain control of Egypt through his daughter, but that didn't work as she actually sided with her husband. And when Ptolemy V died, Cleopatra, his daughter, actually became the true ruler of Egypt as regent for her young son, Ptolemy VI. Now, Antiochus III tried to stand up against Rome, but he was defeated and he returned home to Syria, where he now had to pay tribute to Rome, and also he had to give up his son Antiochus IV, and that's the one we're going to be mainly dealing with, Antiochus IV, as hostage to Rome. Antiochus III was assassinated in a temple near Susa when he was robbing the temple to pay his taxes to Rome. His second son, Seleucus IV Philopator, he became the new king, still had to pay taxes, so he continued to rob temples. He was especially harsh to the Jews. He actually, seized their temple treasury, whereas his father wasn't very harsh to the Jews at all. He was poisoned by his tax collector Heliodorus. Heliodorus declared himself to be the regent upon the death of Seleucus Philopator. Okay, so now we're coming into this session, and here we go. We're looking at Antiochus Epiphanes now, and this is going to go from chapter 11, verse 21 down to 35. This is a lengthy passage. Daniel deals with this key figure that also played a major role back in chapter 8, this guy Antiochus IV Epiphanes. We already dealt with him earlier in chapter 8, but now Daniel returns to him once again. Verses 21 to 35, we're going to look at it in 4 parts. We're going to break it up into 4 parts. We're going to look at his rise to power, verses 21 to 24. Then we're going to look at his first Egyptian campaign in 25 to 28, the third Egyptian campaign in 29 to 30, and then we're going to look at the persecution of the Jews in 30 to 35. Here we go, verse 21. And in his place shall stand up a contemptible person to whom they had not given the honor of the kingdom. But he shall come in time of security and shall obtain the kingdom by flatteries. And the overwhelming forces shall be overwhelmed from before him and shall be broken. Yea, also the prince of the covenant. And after the league made with him, he shall work deceitfully. For he shall come up and shall become strong with a small people. Verse 24 says, in time of security shall he come even upon the fattest places of the province, and he shall do that which his fathers have not done, nor his fathers' fathers. He shall scatter among them prey and spoil and substance. Yea, he shall devise his devices against the strongholds even for a time. Okay. So here in verse 21, the angel revealed that Antiochus Epiphanes would usurp the throne that rightly belonged to the son of the late king Seleucus IV Philopator. In his place, that is, in place of Seleucus IV, shall stand up a contemptible person. Now, that person we see here was Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Hebrew term for contemptible, it comes from a word from the root bazar, meaning to despise. Among the ancient tyrants, Antiochus Epiphanes was the most brutal oppressor of the Jewish people. To whom, carrying on, it says, to whom they had not given the honor of the kingdom. Why do they say that? Because he was not the rightful heir to the throne. The rightful heir was either Demetrius I Soter or Antiochus, both of whom were sons of Seleucus IV Philopator. Now, not only was Antiochus Epiphanes contemptible, but he was also an illegitimate king. With Demetrius I Soter in Roman captivity as a hostage, the rightful heir would have been Seleucus IV's second son, Antiochus. But instead it's going to be his uncle taking over. It says, he shall come in time of security. So Antiochus IV Epiphanes was in Athens when he heard that his brother had been murdered by his tax collector, Heliodorus. And at this time, his young nephew, Antiochus, became the rightful king. So young Antiochus was only about 5 years old when he ascended the throne in 175 BC. But Heliodorus maintained the real power. And at that point, Antiochus Epiphanes arrived in Syria and now proclaimed himself co-ruler in an unlawful succession. What did he do? He killed Heliodorus, and he sent his nephew, young 7-year-old, into the background, pretending to be the boy's legal guardian, but he usurped the throne from him. And shall obtain the kingdom by flatteries, it says. This means he got to be on the throne by intrigue. He received support from another king, the king of Pergamum, a man called Eumenes, by flattery, and then he plotted with him against the legal heir, the young king. And in 169 BC, the young boy died. It's quite possible that his uncle assassinated him, that his uncle Antiochus Epiphanes assassinated him. In verse 22, he begins to consolidate his power. It says, the overwhelming forces shall be overwhelmed from before him and shall be broken. Now, here in the phrase, the overwhelming forces, again, we have the symbolic figure of a flood. And whenever we find that figure used symbolically in Scripture, it always refers to a military invasion. Now, this prophecy was fulfilled by Antiochus Epiphanes' numerous victories, including one in 170 BC when he fought the Egyptians in an area halfway between Gaza and the Nile Delta. He goes on to say here, yea, also the Prince of the Covenant. Now, the Prince of the Covenant, well, this is a reference to the high priest who was the leader of Israel's theocracy. And this descriptive phrase, the covenant, is also mentioned in verses 28 and 32. It's at this point that he murdered the good high priest Onias III. Back in chapter 8, verses 9 to 14, the rightful high priest was Onias III. But then in 175 BC, Antiochus Epiphanes forced Onias out of the office and he replaced him with Jason. Now, Jason was a Hellenizer. He preferred the Greek way of doing things, and he was also brother of Onias III. Now, he developed a conspiracy to have Onias killed by the hand of his own brother, Menelaus, in the year 172 BC. Although they were brothers, Onias was killed by the hand of his own brother. Onias was a righteous man, but Menelaus was an evil man. He was a Hellenist and a conspirator. Now, Menelaus bribed himself into the office of high priest by sending money to Antiochus IV Epiphanes for the privilege. And in verse 23, we read of Antiochus IV growing strength. It says, and after the league made with him, he made leagues with Egypt and other countries. So remember, his own sister Cleopatra I had been married into Egyptian dynasty earlier on. And at this time, she was the Egyptian queen mother. She was the de facto ruler of the Ptolemaic Empire. And Antiochus Epiphanes took advantage of that family bond for a time. Remember, she married him off when he was 5 years old, I think it was. It says, he shall work deceitfully. So there was a bit of a contest going on in Egypt between Cleopatra's two sons, Ptolemy VI, Philometor, and Ptolemy VIII, Physcon. It's the same name as a previous king back in Egypt in 246, long time before this. Now, Antiochus IV Epiphanes supported Philometor, but only for his own political gain. It says, he shall come up and shall become strong with a small people. Now, Antiochus Epiphanes became strong by means of all this deceit. And the word people here, by a small people, means nation. So his own Syrian nation had become small because after his father Antiochus III the Great went against Rome and was defeated, it depleted Syria's forces and Syria's the nation. In verse 24, we come to the growth of his wealth. It says, in time of security, that is, during the time of his own security and the security of those he eventually attacks, when they least expected it. So everything was going honky-dory, everybody was quite happy, but then he attacks them. It says, shall he come even upon the fattest places of the province. Now, the expression the fattest places refers to the most fertile places in the country. So at a time when everyone thought everything was going well, Antiochus Epiphanes came to the most fertile areas of his own province without any warning, and he seized all their produce. It says his own province, of course, was within the Syrian territory, his own land. He shall do that which his fathers have not done, nor his fathers' fathers. Now, his fathers had been involved in plundering, same as what he did, but they used their gains to further their own luxurious living, but not Antiochus Epiphanes. It says, he shall scatter among them prey and spoil and substance. Well, this phrase doesn't mean that he was a generous man, but he was a scheming man. Antiochus used his newly acquired wealth to bribe people and buy favors. It says he shall devise his devices against the strongholds. And this included Egypt and others, even for a time. So this would occur as long as God permitted it. Now, historically, this was for a period of 12 years that he was allowed to do what he was doing here. And then we now come to the first Egyptian campaign, his first attack against Egypt. Remember, Cleopatra's daughter was the queen mother down there. Verse 25 says, and he shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army. And the king of the south shall war in battle with an exceeding great and mighty army, but he shall not stand. For they shall devise devices against him. Verse 26, yea, they that eat of his dainties shall destroy him, and his army shall overflow, and many shall fall down slain. And as for both these kings, their hearts shall be to do mischief, and they shall speak lies at one table, but it shall not prosper. For yet the end shall be at the time appointed. Verse 28, Then shall he return into his land with great substance, and his heart shall be against the holy covenant, and he shall do his pleasure and return to his own land. Okay, now, this passage here describes the first campaign of Antiochus Epiphanes against Egypt. And verses 25 and 26, we have the actual war with Egypt. It says, he shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army. King of the south at this point is Ptolemy the sixth Philometor, one of the two sons of Cleopatra. So this is Antiochus's own nephew that he's going against. And it says he attacks with a great army. He goes against him to regain control of Palestine or Israel, because the land had been given to the Seleucids earlier on as a dowry when, remember Berenice, when she married Antiochus II Theos. So he wants it back. So this Egyptian campaign occurred in 170 BC. And it says, the king of the south shall war in battle with an exceeding great and mighty army. Now, this battle was fought in North Sinai at Mount Casius, also known as Pelusium, and now known as Ras Baron, which is east of the Nile Delta. But it says, he shall not stand. So Ptolemy the sixth Philometor lost. This is the Egyptian king. He lost the battle, and he was actually captured by Antiochus IV Epiphanes. It says, they shall devise devices against him. Now, one reason why he was defeated, why the king of Egypt was defeated, was due to treachery within his own ranks. It says, yea, they that shall eat of his dainties shall destroy him. Now, historically, Ptolemy the sixth most trusted counselors betrayed him to Antiochus. And his army, it says, shall overflow. This refers to the way in which Ptolemy's army overflowed with sheer weight of numbers. Massive army. But, it says, many shall fall down slain. So despite the size of his army, many of them were killed and he lost the battle. This was the first Egyptian campaign. And then in verse 27, we read of his further intrigues. As for both these kings, that is Antiochus IV Epiphanes of Syria and Ptolemy the sixth Philometor of Egypt, it says their hearts shall be to do mischief. So, after Ptolemy was captured in this battle by his uncle, this is by his uncle, his daughter's son, daughter Cleopatra, the people of Alexandria made his brother king, who became Ptolemy the eighth Sicon. At this point, Antiochus now pretended friendship with Philometor, whom he captured, hoping in this way to gain control of all Egypt by promising him to get his throne back for him. Now, it says, I shall speak lies at one table. So, when Antiochus pretended to be working to restore Philometor to the throne, Philometor pretended to believe him. And in typical diplomatic fashion, neither trusted the other at all. But the prophet goes on to say, but it shall not prosper. The common plan between them failed because Antiochus IV Epiphanes only succeeded in making Philometor a puppet king of a place called Memphis because the people of Alexandria rejected him to be reinstated as Egypt's ruler. They were happy with Sicon, who they had. So when Antiochus finally left Egypt empty-handed, the two brothers, Ptolemy the sixth and Ptolemy the eighth, actually reconciled and agreed to rule the kingdom jointly instead of fighting a civil war. So after Antiochus had now left Egypt, the two brothers established a joint rule, and Philometor married his sister Cleopatra, who had been named after their mother. For yet the end shall be for at the time appointed. Now, what this is saying here is that he appointed time for the end of the conflicts between the kings of the north and the south. So that had not yet arrived. In verse 28, we read of Antiochus' return to Syria. It says this is after trying to do the deal down south. It didn't work. Then shall he return into his own land with great substance, and his heart shall be against the holy covenant, and he shall do his pleasure and return to his own land. Now, although he returned with great substance, yet he had failed in his ultimate goal to take over all of Egypt. And that made him pretty angry. And he's going to take it out on somebody. It says, his heart shall be against the holy covenant. Now, the holy covenant refers to the theocracy of the nation of Israel under the high priest. So at that time, there was a man named Jason. This was the brother of Menelaus and Onias, who had been murdered. And Jason was the one who was currently the high priest. Menelaus had now become the high priest, and Jason now rebelled against him. And when Antiochus IV Epiphanes returned through the country on his way back to Syria, he put Jason's revolt down. It says, he shall do his pleasure, and that pleasure we see in the book of 1 Maccabees, chapter 1, verses 20 to 28, and 2 Maccabees, chapter 5, 11 to 17. If you have an apocrypha in your Bible, you'll find those books there. Okay, it says, then he'll return to his own land, but only after causing a great amount of suffering in Israel. In fact, he killed 40,000 Jews, men, women, and children, on his way back to Syria, and he also took 40,000 Jews as slaves. So finally, Antiochus Epiphanes returned to his own land, Syria. Now we come to the third Egyptian campaign. We see this in chapter 29, chapter 11, verse 29 to 30, first part of verse 30. This is the third campaign which he conducted in the year 168 BC. At the time appointed he shall return and come into the south, but it shall not be in the latter time as it was in the former. For ships of Kittim shall come against him. Okay, we'll just stop there. Now, we've already read about his first campaign. The second campaign, which he undertook in 169 BC, is not even mentioned in the book of Daniel. He only deals with the first and the third campaigns. It says, at the time appointed. Now, it means it happened at the time when God had appointed it should take place. So God is indeed the one who is in control, making all things come to pass. So at that time, he had learned of the agreement between the two Egyptian brothers, and he realized that he had been betrayed by a Philometor. But it goes on, it shall not be in the latter time as it was in the former, meaning that this time Antiochus Epiphanes would not be so victorious. Indeed, when he was on the brink of annexing Egypt to Syria, problem. And the problem was that the ships of Kittim shall come against him. Now, Kittim is the island of Cyprus. Sometimes the word Kittim was used as a name for any location west of Israel. Now, we had these ships here, these ships from Kittim. These ships were Roman galleys which came into Egypt after being anchored at Kittim or Cyprus. And Antiochus IV Epiphanes was met near Alexandria by another Roman consul named Gaius Popilius Laenas. Now, this Roman ordered Antiochus IV Epiphanes to leave Egypt. And this was a time when Rome was rising to power. At that point, Antiochus said he wished to consult with his advisors before he made a decision. So the Roman consul took a stick and he drew a circle around the ground where Antiochus IV was standing and ordered him to make his decision before he stepped outside the circle or face a Roman attack. Antiochus was not ready for that, and so he was publicly humiliated and reluctantly agreed to withdraw from Egypt. So when all else fails, blame the Jews. That set the stage for the next section. And here we come into the persecution of the Jews, which we're going to look at the second part of verse 30 down to 35. In 30 to 31, we see the persecution. Therefore shall he, second part of verse 30, therefore shall he shall be grieved and shall return and have indignation against the holy covenant and shall do his pleasure. He shall even return and have regard unto them that forsake the holy covenant. Verse 31, and forces shall stand on his part, and they shall profane the sanctuary, even the fortress, and shall take away the continual burnt offering, and they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate. Okay, Daniel now starts to describe the persecution in these verses. Verse 30, second part of verse 30 concerns the apostates or the Jewish apostasy. Therefore shall he be grieved. Well, he was grieved because he was repelled by Rome. So Antiochus IV Epiphanes will now vent his wrath on the Jews. It says he shall return. So on his way back from down in Egypt, on his way back to Syria, he again stopped in Jerusalem, which lay along his route home, and he began an even more severe persecution of the Jewish people. It says he shall have indignation against the Holy Covenant. Again, the Holy Covenant, as back in verse 28, Holy Covenant refers to the Jewish theocracy under the high priest. And at that time, there was wrath against the Jews. In his wrath, Antiochus Epiphanes shall do his pleasure, which means he will unashamedly carry out his program against the Jews. Now, the angel foretold that Antiochus Epiphanes would even return, indicating that the king would come to Israel multiple times to commit the same atrocities. A section of the Jewish population had now become apostates by this. It says, and have regard unto them that forsake the Holy Covenant. Now, the ones who forsake the Holy Covenant are these Jewish apostates, or they were Hellenizers, right? These were the Jews who favored Greek culture over Mosaic law. So they were really apostates. So these were operating under the leadership of the murderer Menelaus, who had killed his brother Onias. And they supported the enforcement of Greek culture, religion, and literature, and Greek everything. This was under the auspices of the high priest Menelaus. And this is confirmed in 2 Maccabees 4:7-50. So this Hellenizing party came to the aid of Antiochus IV against their own Jewish people. And in verse 31, Antiochus Epiphanes commits the abomination of desolation. In verse 31, the angel informed Daniel that the Hellenizing forces would stand on his part. The personal pronoun his refers to Antiochus Epiphanes. And forces shall stand on his part, which means that he would have the help of these apostate Jews. And this is found in 1 Maccabees 1:43. 1 Maccabees 1 verse 43 records the way in which he received help from the apostate Jews. Yea, this is Maccabees. Yea, many also of the Israelites consented to his religion and sacrificed unto idols and profaned the Sabbath. So on a specific Sabbath day, Antiochus Epiphanes went as far as to profane the sanctuary by offering a pig on the altar. And they shall profane the sanctuary. 1 Maccabees 1:47 records the atrocity. They set up altars and groves and chapels of idols and sacrifice of swine's flesh and unclean beasts. That's what the Maccabees recorded. He goes on to say here, even the fortress. Now, this was the building which guarded the temple. This was also attacked and defiled. And the account of this is given in 1 Maccabees 1:33-37. I'll read that for you here. It says, then they fortified the city of David with a great strong wall and strong towers, and became their citadel. They stationed there a sinful people, men who were renegades. These strengthened their position. They stored up arms and food, and collecting the spoils of Jerusalem, they stored them there and became a great menace. For the citadel became an ambush against the sanctuary, an evil adversary of Israel at all times. On every side of the sanctuary they shed innocent blood. They even defiled the sanctuary. So these were the apostate Jews who had taken over this sanctuary, this fortress, and this is what they were doing. It says, and they shall take away the continual burnt offering. This was the daily sacrificial system was now removed. First Maccabees 1:45-47 tells us this. This forced cessation of the sacrificial system we see here in 44-45, First Maccabees 1. And the king sent letters by messengers to Jerusalem and the towns of Judah. He directed, this is Antiochus IV, he directed them to follow customs strange to the land, to forbid burnt offerings and sacrifices and drink offerings in the sanctuary, to profane the Sabbaths and festivals. So that was the order by Antiochus IV Epiphanes. It says, they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate. So the ultimate desecration of the Holy Temple happened when Antiochus Epiphanes, he set up the abomination that makes desolate. What he did was he erected an image for Zeus Olympius. That was the Greek name for the Roman god known as Jupiter among the Romans. And then what did he do? He set this image up, and then he offered up the sacrifice of a pig. All Sabbath observances were now outlawed, and some soldiers also engaged in prostitution and other sexual rites in the Jewish temple precincts. All of this is found in 1 Maccabees 1:54-59 and 2 Maccabees 6, verses 2-5. I'll read 2 Maccabees 6 for you. Not long after this, the king sent Geron the Athenian to force the Jews to abandon the laws of their ancestors and live no longer by the laws of God. Also to profane the temple in Jerusalem and dedicate it to Olympian Zeus, and the one on Mount Gerizim to Zeus, the host of the strangers, as the local inhabitants were wont to be. This was a harsh and utterly intolerable evil. The Gentiles filled the temple with debauchery and revelry. They amused themselves with prostitutes and had intercourse with women, even in the sacred courts. They also brought forbidden things into the temple, so that the altar was covered with abominable offerings prohibited by the laws. Okay. Verses 32-35, the angel foretold how the Jews would respond to these atrocities, starting with the rise of the Maccabees. And such as do wickedly against the covenant shall he pervert by flatteries. But the people that know their God shall be strong and do exploits. And they that are wise among the peoples shall instruct many. Yet they shall fall by the sword and by flame, by captivity and by spoil many days. Verse 34. Now when they shall fall, they shall be helped with a little help. But many shall join themselves unto them with flatteries. And some of them that are wise shall fall to refine them and to purify them, and to make them white, even to the time of the end, because it is yet for the time appointed. Okay, so in the first part of verse 32, the policy of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, we see it here. Such as do wickedly against the covenant shall he pervert by flattery. So, historically, Antiochus Epiphanes fulfilled the first part of this prophecy in the following manner. Those Jewish apostates who turned on their own people and did wickedly against the covenant, he encouraged by corrupting them with flatteries or bribes. And by pitting one element of the population against another, he gained control of the entire population. And then he elevated the apostates into positions of authority. And his scheme led to the revolt of the Maccabees. Second part of verse 32-35, we have the revolt of the Maccabees here. The people that know their God shall be strong and do exploits. These were the Maccabees. As the angel foretold, they remained strong in the Lord and engaged in exploits. They were strong in the Lord, and eventually they were able to defeat every army that Antiochus IV Epiphanes sent against them. They used guerrilla warfare and defeated one army after another. Now, these exploits that Daniel refers to are well recorded in history and can be found in the book of Maccabees. We see it in Maccabees 2, verse 1 to 13, and also Maccabees 16, verse 1 to 2, and 2nd Maccabees chapter 8, verse 1 to chapter 15, verse 39. This lists the history of the Maccabees and what they did. So in one battle after another, the Maccabees proved victorious. In verse 33, he also tells us about the Hasidim. This is no relationship to the present Hasidic movement. This is another element in the Jewish society of the 2nd century BC that is not well known. These were the righteous ones in Israel who maintained the law and are referred to here as the wise. It says, "They that are wise among the people shall instruct many." Now, following the decree of Antiochus Epiphanes forbidding the teaching of the law, these Hasidim set up an underground schools program and continued to teach the law. And they also formed a small army that led a small rebellion against the Syrians. But it says, "Yet they shall fall." So many of them died by persecution over many days. And the means of accomplishing their death was by the sword, by flame, by captivity, and by spoil. The Hasidim had a policy of not fighting on the Sabbath day. And when the Syrians learned that, that's when they attacked. So when the Maccabees led the revolt, they removed that element of the policy. It says that many will die in persecution, and we have two very graphic examples from this period. First of all, there was Eleazar the scribe. He was an old man who they tried to force to eat pork. Remember, pork was banned by the Mosaic law. He refused to do it, and he lost his life as a result. This we see in 2nd Maccabees 6, verse 18 to 31. The second account concerns a mother who had 7 sons. They are all arrested for practicing the Mosaic rituals and the law. They were brought before the ruler, and each one was asked one by one to do something to desecrate the law. As each son was subjected to extreme torture, their mother would exhort and encourage them to remain strong. One by one, she had to watch all 7 of her sons tortured and killed because they would not violate the Mosaic law. And this is found in 2nd Maccabees 7, verses 1 to 42. And I believe that while they were being tortured, she was encouraging them to stay strong. And all this points out how they shall fall by various means. Now, not only will many of the Hasidim fall, but in verse 34 we also read of the fall of the Maccabees. Now, when they shall fall, that is the Hasidim, they shall be helped with a little help. So all of this was in fulfillment of the angel's prophecy that they shall fall. This means here that the Hasidim were being helped by the Maccabees, who did succeed in freeing Israel from the Syrians, yet at a very great cost. There are 5 Maccabee brothers, and it says, "Yet they shall fall." None of them died from natural causes. 3 of the 5 Maccabee brothers died in battle. The last 2 died by treachery. Many shall join themselves unto them by flatteries. So what we see here is that many of the Jews who actually preferred Hellenism joined the Maccabees' cause only because they were being successful. They didn't necessarily agree with their theology or their goals that motivated the rebellion. And later, they began to influence the whole group. These are the Hellenizers, and the apostates succeeded in corrupting some of the grandsons of the Maccabees. And these followed the strong lead given by their parents and became greater Hellenizers than those the Maccabees had actually fought. In verse 35, we read of the divine purpose for this persecution. Some of them that are wise shall fall. This has to do with both the Hasidim, the wise, and the Maccabees. God declared that he would allow the persecution of his people for three reasons. First, to refine them. Second, to purify them. And third, to make them white. Now, by going to the extreme point of being willing to give up their lives for the cause of the scriptures, they showed their righteous standing before God. And the persecution these suffered, rather than inducing them to become Hellenists, refined and purified them and made them white. And this divine purpose is also mentioned in Hebrews chapter 11, verses 17 to 19, and James chapter 1, verse 3. God allows faith to be tested and purified by persecution and trials. And at the end of verse 35, we come to a transition from Antiochus IV Epiphanes to the Antichrist. We get another break here, as we had in chapter 8, between Antiochus as the type and the fulfillment of the type in the Antichrist. It says, even to the time of the end. Now, as challenging as what was happening on the Antiochus Epiphanes was, the abomination of desolation and the persecution of the Jews, it will not be the greatest trial for the Jewish people. The greatest trial will be reserved for the time of the end, which will occur at the time appointed, i.e., in the prophetic future. This last statement is a statement of the prophetic future. All of Daniel 11, verse 2 to 35 was literally fulfilled. We can find an exact correspondence between the text of these verses and the history outlined. Verses 21 to 35 were all literally fulfilled by Antiochus IV Epiphanes. However, verses 36 to 45 have never been fulfilled unless we resort to spiritualizing the text, which we won't do. If the first 35 verses were literally fulfilled, then we have a right to expect that the following verses will also be literally fulfilled. Again, verses 21 to 35 were clearly fulfilled by, or literally fulfilled by Antiochus Epiphanes, as was every verse before that up to Daniel chapter 11, verse 2. Everything contained in verses 2 to 35 had been totally fulfilled. On the other hand, nothing from verse 36 to the end of chapter 21 has yet been fulfilled. This is all for the prophetic future. Now, just as in chapter 8, Antiochus Epiphanes was spoken of first and then the Antichrist, because Antiochus was a type of the Antichrist, the same thing is happening in chapter 11. What Antiochus Epiphanes has done historically, the Antichrist will do in prophecy. So in verses 36 to 45, we now have to deal with the Antichrist. This section is divided into two parts because in verse 35, there's a transitional statement. It says, even to the time of the end. And then in verse 40, and at the time of the end. All right. So in the first segment here, he deals with the nature of the Antichrist and his rise to political and religious power. Then in the second segment, he'll deal with the conquest of the Antichrist. So his nature and rise to power we're going to look at now. In verses 36 to 39, the angel who had started speaking to Daniel back in chapter 10, verse 19, described the nature and the ascent of the Antichrist. Previously, the figure of the Antichrist had been identified as the little horn, remember back in chapter 7, verse 8 and 20, and the coming prince we saw in chapter 9, verse 26. I'll read it 36 to 39. And the king shall do according to his will, and he shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods. He shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished, for that which is determined shall be done. Neither shall he regard the gods of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any god, for he shall magnify himself above all. But in his place shall he honor the God of fortresses, and the God whom his fathers knew not shall he honor with gold and silver and with precious stones and pleasant things. And he shall deal with the strongest fortresses by the help of a foreign god. Whosoever acknowledges him, he will increase with glory, and he shall cause them to rule over many, and he shall divide the land for a price. All right. Here we read, verse 36, we read about the rise of the willful king. The king shall do according to his will. Like Antiochus IV Epiphanes, he will be characterized by willfulness. He shall exalt himself above every other man. The Antichrist will be characterized by so much willfulness that he will exalt himself above every other man and God. And he'll magnify himself above every god. In fact, he's going to claim deity for himself. And we learn this from 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 3 to 4. Let no man beguile you in any wise, for it will not be except the falling away come first, and the man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition. He that opposes and exalts himself against all that is called God or that is worshipped. So he sits in the temple of God, setting himself forth as God. Paul, the Apostle Paul, says that the Antichrist will sit in the temple of God, setting himself forth as God. Now, the Apostle John reaffirms the same thing in Revelation chapter 13, verses 1 to 8, where he points out that the Antichrist will lay claim to deity and call upon the whole world to worship him as God. Also, this verse says, he shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods. Now, speaking marvelous things against the God of gods means that he's railing against the one true God, which is exactly what Daniel said about the little horn back in chapter 7, verse 25. Chapter 7, 25. So this is the same personality as the little horn of Daniel 7:25, which also speaks of the Antichrist. It says, he shall prosper until the indignation be accomplished. Now, the word indignation is one of the Old Testament names for the Great Tribulation, especially as it affects the Jewish people. This means that he will rule during the tribulation, and we know that he rules for the second half of it, or the last 3.5 years of it. Now, the word indignation is not just a term for the tribulation. It's often used as a term that spells out how the tribulation will affect the Jewish people. Why? Because during his rule in the second half of the tribulation, he'll be especially against the Jews, setting up a worldwide holocaust against them. This means he will prosper as long as the indignation lasts. And the indignation, we know, will be accomplished after a total of 3.5 years, reckoning from the middle to the end of the tribulation. Now, as we mentioned back quite a ways back in chapter 8, verse 19, the term indignation refers to the tribulation. We see it also in Isaiah 26:20. The purpose of this this period of time is to make an end to wickedness and wicked ones. It's also to bring about a worldwide revival and to break the power of the holy people. We're going to see that in Daniel 12 when we get there. Now, during the second half of the tribulation, the Antichrist will be the sole ruler of the world. And the word indignation now spells out how the tribulation will affect the Jewish people. During his rule, the Antichrist will direct his wrath against God's people, starting a global holocaust against them. And the angel further revealed in the second part of verse 36 that the Antichrist will be allowed to prosper until the indignation be accomplished, namely after 3.5 years. Persecution of the Jewish people will be so severe that according to Zechariah 13:8-9, 2/3 of them will be killed. It shall come to pass, Zechariah says, that in all the land, says Jehovah, 2 parts therein shall be cut off and die, but the third shall be left therein. And I'll bring the third part into the fire, and will refine them as silver is refined, and will try them as gold is tried. They shall call in my name, and I'll hear them. I will say, it is my people, and they shall say, Jehovah is my God. Finally, in verse 36 now, it says, that which is determined shall be done. The word determined means to be decreed. Because it has been decreed by heaven, it is irrevocable. It's going to happen. The duration of the decree we know is for 3.5 years. That's also irrevocable. It will not be extended beyond that. Verse 36 describes the Antichrist as an autocratic king who will exalt himself and speak blasphemies against God. He'll experience temporary success. In verse 37, we read of the nature of the willful king. Neither shall he regard the gods of his fathers. Now, that expression has been translated in the King James Version as the God, or true God, of his fathers, using the singular word God with a capital G. This has been one of the strongest proofs that people have used to try to show that the Antichrist will be a Jew. However, the King James Version translation is the only translation that did this with a capital G, making a reference to the God of Israel. The proper translation is to make it a plural with a small g. The word is gods. Between verse 36 and 39, the word God is used a number of times. In the Hebrew text, every use of the word God in this entire context occurs in the singular, with one exception right here. And that is in this expression, the gods of his fathers. This is the only time it's used in the plural in the Hebrew text. So the emphasis here is not that the Antichrist will not regard the God of his fathers, as if this was a reference to the one true God, but it's regarding the pagan gods of his fathers. Daniel is not dealing with the Jewish God here, but pagan gods. And this is clearly brought out in the Hebrew text by the use of the plural word for gods. Okay, so King James is the only translation that has not corrected this error. Yeah, so this actually points to the Antichrist as being of a Gentile origin. What we're going to see is that he'll repudiate all the gods of his Gentile ancestors, and this is obvious in the overall scope of the book of Daniel. Because remember, both in chapter 2 and in chapter 7, this is the final ruler of the times of the Gentiles. Therefore, he must be a Gentile, all right? We also learn in Daniel 9, 26 to 27, he will be specifically a Gentile of Roman origin. So the point of this verse here is that he will repudiate the gods of his Gentile ancestors. He'll worship a God, as we're going to see, but it'll not be the gods that his ancestors worship. It's going to be a different God. The second thing about his nature is that nor will he regard the desire of women. Now, the desire of women has two possible meanings here. It might mean that he'll have no regard for that which women desire. Now, what does that mean? Well, historically, in the time of Daniel, especially in the days of Antiochus Epiphanes, the women had a desire for a specific cult, either the Tammuz cult or the Adonis cult. The Tammuz cult was Babylonian, the Adonis was Greek. These were extremely popular with the women in the days of Antiochus Epiphanes, and both had basically the same theology. It was a concept of a dying and a rising God. The God would die in autumn or in fall as winter came, and he'd rise again in the spring when summer was coming. Now, if this phrase means that he'll have no regard for that which women desire, then these are the gods he repudiates, Tammuz and Adonis. One thing this does not refer to is the legend that it says that every Jewish woman must be the mother of Messiah. This is the legend which was developed among the Gentiles, which the Jews know nothing about anyway. So it's not the desire of Jewish women here, all right? Gentile women. So if it is dealing with that which women specifically desire, then it would refer to the desire for what women worship, whatever that desire might be in the days of the Antichrist. It might even be the worship of the Madonna of Roman Catholicism. However, it could also mean something completely different. This is the second interpretation. This is the second possibility. It's probably the better option, actually, that it refers to a desire for women, right? In that case, the Antichrist will not have any particular desire for the love of women, which is natural to normal men. He'd then be quite inhuman in his complete disregard for women. So rather than taking this to mean that which women desire, it would be better to take it to mean that which in women is desirable. The Antichrist will have no particular desire for women. So on the one hand, he'll not regard the gods of his fathers, which demonstrates something of his attitude in the religious sense. But on the other hand, neither will he have any desire for women in the natural sexual sense. Third, nor will he regard any god, either the true or the false god. Rather, he shall magnify himself above all, meaning above men, women, and God. He will assume that he is superior to God and pagan gods and above men and women. Now, this does not mean that he'll be atheistic, because verse 38 tells us what the true religion of this willful king will be. In verse 38, it says, in his place he shall honor the God of fortresses. The Hebrew term for fortresses refers to places or means of safety and protection. We see this term used in Daniel 11, verse 7, 10, 19, 31, 39. Daniel 11, 7, 10, 19, 31, 39. The term is used of a fortified military defense. So the Antichrist will worship a God of strongholds who promises strength and military might. In other words, he's going to worship power and might. His philosophy will be might is right. Furthermore, it says, a God whom his fathers knew not shall he honor. The God he will honor will be Satan. Even his pagan ancestors did not directly worship Satan. At best, indirectly through idolatry, but not directly. He is going to directly worship Satan and honor him with gold, silver, and with precious stones and pleasant things. So verse 38 prophesies that the Antichrist will not be an atheist, but he's going to actually worship Satan, a God whom his Gentile ancestors did not know. In verse 39, we come to the policy of the willful king. Two things. He shall deal with the strongest of fortresses with the help of a foreign god. So his ability to conquer will come from the God whom he does worship, that's Satan. So he's going to receive some supernatural power through Satan to conquer the mightiest of strongholds. And because he worships Satan, Satan will give him that power. Same thing is brought out by Paul in 2 Thessalonians 2, 8 to 10 and Revelation 13, 1 to 10 by John. He points out that because the Antichrist will accept the very offer that Jesus rejected, remember Jesus was offered to worship Satan and he'd have all the kingdoms of the world. The Antichrist will accept the worship of Satan and Satan will give him the kingdoms of the world. And he'll be given supernatural abilities to take over the world. Second thing about this policy is that whosoever acknowledges him, he will increase with glory. Word acknowledge means to confess him, specifically to confess him as God. On the one hand, he worships Satan as his God, but on the other hand, he will claim to be God himself and reward those who accept him as such. So this indicates that all those who acknowledge the Antichrist to be God will be rewarded for their loyalty. He will increase them with glory, and they'll be granted a superior social and economic status. He'll cause them to rule over many. What he's going to do is he's going to elevate them to positions of political authority over people under his universal rule. He shall divide the land for a price. Any territory he conquers, he will divide for a price. That means those who will be loyal to himself. It'll mean loyalty to the point of owning him as their God. In fact, John says in Revelation 13, 16 to 18, it describes the nature of this loyalty. Revelation 13, 16, and he causes all, the small and the great, and the rich and the poor, the free and the bond, that there be given them a mark on their right hand or upon their forehead, and that no man should be able to buy or to sell, save he that has the mark, even the name of the beast or the number of his name. Here is wisdom. He that has understanding, let him count the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. So they're going to have to signify their acceptance of him as God by taking his mark, his number of 666. For this they'll be rewarded. Verse 39 prophesies that the Antichrist's rise to power will come supernaturally through the power of Satan, and Satan will use the willful king in his attempts to annihilate the Jewish people once and for all. And these verses deal with his rise to power and his nature as a person. And then in the next session, we'll look at his conquests. Okay, that's the end for this session. Thank you for coming along. Study hard, grow strong.